She worked with her shoulders bent over a crate of spare filters, the warehouse lights turning the metal ribs of the stack into a geometry of cold white. Outside the heavy doors, the base hummed with its usual low arrogance. Generators, aero lifts, the smell of diesel and coffee. An atmosphere bred on precision and 1,000 small displays of rank. Inside, among the pallets and racks, she was nearly invisible. Plain jacket patched where a sleeve had been sewn twice, boots scuffed but oiled, hair pulled back into a practical knot. The tag at her throat was civilian white, a rectangle of laminated paper on a cord. It read her name and a contractor code. To the polished eyes that swept the warehouse, it read nothing at all. She knew the tag made them comfortable. It placed her in the one category they understood, outside the hierarchy, harmless, replaceable. She liked that. She had cultivated invisibility the way other people collected medals. Her hands worked in a rhythm that had become natural. Lift, rotate, check the serial, file the discrepancy. A senior officer's boot scuffed past, then halted, the soles cutting a clean arc across the concrete. He wore the world on his chest. Ribbons, brass, a colonel's confident weight. Colonel Marchand lingered at the edge of a pallet, the way predators hung at the door of a prey's burrow. He let his gaze travel over her, her jacket, the civilian tag, the plainness, and found the entertainment he wanted. He laughed, a short bark that turned into the kind of derisive grin practiced in mess halls and officers' clubs. "You there," he called, voice sharp enough to shape the air into hearing. "Logistics, is it? Thought they sent someone to mop the floors." She did not look up. His laugh spread. 2 lieutenants nearby echoed it, then 3, then voices like a flock folding closed. A few heads turned, a camera phone blinked somewhere. "Civilian contractor," Marchand said, louder, tasting the word like a sharp fruit. "They let anyone in these days." She slid a plate into place and tightened the clamp. The action was efficient, unremarked. He stepped forward, the laugh grating into something meaner. His hand reached toward the tag at her throat, as if to pluck it away. "Let me see that," he demanded. Her fingers did not flinch. She held the clamp like an anchor. "The tag," Marchand barked. "Are you some kind of—" He never finished. She spoke once. The voice was low, controlled. 2 words. He left it. The room emptied its laughter into a curious hush. Marchand's grin tightened because he did not understand the weight of the words. To him, it was a throwaway, a punchline turned over the railing. He stepped back as if he had been struck. "He left it," he repeated, mockery flaking away like old paint. This was not the humiliation he expected. This was something else, an intangible that smelled faintly of answer and of memory. She finished the plate and pushed it onto the cart, precise motion, no show. They went back to their jokes, early laughter like the beginning of a storm, but the seed of doubt had been planted. It was a small moment. She let them have it and gathered the crate. There were other moments, a pattern of small cruelties that had been stacking for months. A posted picture here, a mocking caption there. A bet made over coffee about whether she would faint at the salute. A chant started by Night Watch that name-checked her tag each time a convoy went by. At briefings, she sat at the back, hands folded, while Marchand lectured on protocols he never missed and on honors he had collected like small, enameled trophies. He used her as shorthand for what outsiders looked like, inadequate and object lesson. Once, when they inspected the firing lane, someone had knocked her crate of custom ammo into the dust and watched with thin enjoyment as she scrambled, collecting rounds while faces watched. They called the rounds junk, as if the metal and brass could be dismissed by language. She did not fight then. She collected. She cleaned. She filed. She left the rounds in a box under a bench where she could check them when no one was watching. The corruption that softened in the corners of that place was small and insidious. There was the gatekeeper, Sergeant Lon, who favored certain contractors with paperwork and held others back with a raised eyebrow and a stamped denial. Lon had the power to call a trial restrictive, to find a hazard, to declare an equipment piece unfit for demonstration. He was the one who had declared her pistol unsafe before the weekly showcase, citing a minute technicality about the firing pin. They sent her home that day, the tag at her throat conspicuous as a replaced tooth. The humiliation burned in a way she had learned to measure. It was a weight and a measuring stick. She went home and worked on the small things that mattered to her, polishing the slide, checking the timing, aligning the sights until they were a plan etched in metal. There had been a past. She let it lay like a map folded into a pocket. She had not told the men who mocked her about the years behind it, about a unit that had been whisper and legend, about a father who taught steadiness as if it were a religion. They had called him Old Ghost, someone who had walked away when the world tilted. She called him Father, and she had his tag. What Marchand saw as a joke was a worn rectangle with a hole at one corner, where years of sweat and handling had softened the lamination. At night, when the base fell to its whispering, she would sit over a bench light and run a finger over the letters on that tag. They thought the tag said civilian. They did not see the history that bled from its edges. The president's convoy was not supposed to pass through this part of the base. Routes were planned, schedules written, redundancies checked a week in advance. But the bad weather and an unexpected security measure rerouted an official path by necessity. Top officials found themselves walking through the supply yard and the maintenance lanes. It was a small chaos that put the top of the world within arm's reach of their little world of pallets and dust. They halted the convoy by the warehouse gate. The president himself was a distant silhouette inside the armored car, a presence felt rather than seen. Security clustered like a second skin around the vehicles, black, precise, practiced. Someone opened a door meant to stay shut. An assistant stumbled, and in a half-second of human misstep, a senior minister stepped out and walked through the yard like a man taking a shortcut. Marchand noticed the shift. His eyes went bright. This was a window, an audience, a stage. He straightened, ribbons catching light, and made sure his posture announced consequence. The coterie gathered, young captains with shining short hair, a civilian group with badges that looked expensive, the gatekeeper lawn lingering near his clipboard, as if the clipboard could anchor his authority. A buzz started, a tide of small ambitions anxious to crest. They were not prepared. The minister stepped off the convoy and, with an awkward grace, made his way toward the maintenance line. He was curious about the logistics of it, how supplies moved, where delays occurred. He wanted facts, not faces. He walked past Marchand and did not pause. He did not notice an officer's self-importance the way those officers did. Then he saw her. She had been crouched to the second shelf, hands in a crate, head bent. When he looked, she straightened and offered the most basic human posture, attention to another person, a small acknowledgement. The minister did not think to sniff at her tag. Something in his face loosened, as though an old habit of attention smoothed the lines of his jaw. He halted, and the world made a new sound, a whisper of recognition. This man, who spent his life in rooms where every hair's breadth of protocol had meaning, moved as if probability had shifted. The minister crossed to her with an ease that broke the choreography of the place. He reached out and took the tag between his fingers like a man who had found a rare coin in a pocket. He read the name, then the line beneath it. His eyes flicked, and there was a precise change. A map redrawn in a single breath. He walked away, voice lowered, and spoke into a radio clipped to his sleeve. Something like urgency and recognition slid in his words. Within moments, the convoy doors opened. Officials moved with a new speed, a new deference. Protocols rewrote themselves in the motion of their bodies. They arrived where she stood, and the air around them tightened into the halo of consequence. Marchand's smile cracked. His mouth made the small, brittle signs of a man aware of a misstep in a game he thought he controlled. The minister stepped close and touched the laminated tag as if it were a medallion, then looked up with steady eyes and said a name that made the warehouse tilt. Her father's call sign. The warehouse listened like a forest holding its breath. Marchand's shoulders went hard. His face drained of color as if color itself were a commodity he had misallocated. The coterie watched. Phones rose. Cameras found hands. Lon held his clipboard as if it might cover him. The minister did not ask for her to speak. He did not question her past. He announced it without flourish, the way facts had to be given weight in a room, suddenly forgetting the weight it had once carried. "You are Anna Marcel of Meridian," he said. The name landed like a verdict. It was not spoken loud, because it did not need to be. It reverberated as if someone had struck metal. The tag, once a symbol of nothing, became a map that connected to an old, storied unit and to echoing tales of operations so precise their names had become shorthand for skill. Marchand's arrogance, which had been a small, comfortable hill of soil, collapsed into a pit. No one had told them. No one had needed to. The minister's phone transmitted orders. A man in a dark suit reached for the radio and called for a briefing. A captain came forward and offered a crisp salute that was both apology and recognition. They were leaning on every hierarchy that existed to catch them. The hierarchies shifted like tiles underfoot. The coterie leaned away from Marchand, faces pale. Their laughter turned into a backwash of embarrassment. She stood like someone who had rehearsed patience in a muscle. She did not smile. She did not demand vindication. Her hands rested at her sides, steady as trunnions. Marchand made a motion, an awkward salute that arrived late. He opened his mouth, and his authority flapped like a flag in an unpredictable wind. She said one thing, soft and lean. He left it to his daughter. The words made a line between her and the ranks. They clarified something that had been inked only in rumor and nurturing silence. A protocol officer arrived and offered a folder. She took it without fanfare. She read. She set the folder down like a map whose edges had been smoothed by knowing hands. Then she stepped away from the crate and toward the lane where the minster's assistant had placed a small target on a makeshift stand. This was not planned. No one had made this theater. But the hubris of the men present demanded spectacle, and the base had a habit of obliging its own vanity. She removed a pistol from under her jacket. It was not showy. The metal caught the light in a private way, like a hidden spring in a stone. She did not brandish it. She simply held it with the same quiet clarity with which she had handled a wrench or a clamp. Marchand stepped in front of the lane, as if to put himself between her and the audience, to make sure the moment conformed to his comfort. The minister raised a hand. He was not theatrical. He had spoken into a life that demanded results. He said only enough. "We need certainty." She nodded, a small motion. "No fireworks." No words. A single, focused intention. They found themselves in a cadence, a simple count of breath. She placed the pistol to the ready, sights folding over the target center. Her hands were stone. Her breath was steady. The warehouse dissolved into the sound of a single gear turning. Shot 1. A clean report. The target's bullseye shook. Shot 2. Same rhythm. Bullseye. Shot 3 landed without hesitation. The sequence was note-perfect, a small mechanical symphony with her as conductor. Silence struck back like a tangible thing. The officials' phones were still. Lon's clipboard had slid onto the floor like a judge's gavel that had been put down too abruptly. A veteran in plain clothes, someone whose life had been measured in operations and after-action reports, stepped forward. He watched the grouping, the spacing, the way the sights whispered across a cheekbone. He lifted a hand and gave the smallest nod of recognition, the kind of throat-clearing fact that confirmed legends. "You did more than that," he said, and the words were not to her so much as to the room. "You taught people how to see a line." Marchand's face was a map of small losses. He had spent years learning how to be the center of attention. Attention had slipped from him like oil from a catcher's mitt. The coterie could not laugh. Their mockery had no purchase. The phones that had been held up to film a fiasco now captured a dismantling. Their faces were recorded for a memory that would be replayed with different colors. An apology came from one of the captains later, halting and clumsy. He put his hand to his chest and said the words like a man saying a pledge he had not met. "We misjudged you," he said. She nodded once. It was not your place to judge. She did not take center stage after that. She did not sign autographs or make speeches. She continued to hold the small, authoritative presence she always had. The minister asked for a private word, and she stepped into a small office with him. The conversation was practical and brief. He needed an assessment of supply lines, a report on an obscure logistic bottleneck. She provided the kind of answer that reshaped strategy for a corridor. A respectful authority, someone with the bearing of a life lived in the service of countries and calculations, offered her a role, consult on the very protocols that had once deemed her a hazard. She accepted on a condition that surprised no one who had watched her life. She would not sit in the sun of fame. She would sit behind the glass, the unseen hand. She would teach those who had no voice how to move in the world with steadiness. Marchand found himself reassigned out of the lane of ceremony to a desk where ribbons mattered more than categorization. The reassignment was procedural, the humiliation public. He kept his rank, but ranks are brittle when the stories that justify them are proved false. Sergeant Lon lost his privileged paper route. Paperwork is currency on bases. Losing it was a small, quiet form of poverty. The coterie scattered like birds when a hawk passes. Some left the base, some apologized, some were remembered as a dull chapter. The veteran who had nodded came to see her more than once. He became a kind of covert ally, an older man who recognized that legends were living things and that they needed careful tending. A skeptic in logistics, a young woman named Reyes, had once mocked the tag in a moment of thoughtless cruelty. She came to the warehouse months later with a new look in her eyes and a packet of notes that had her handwriting. She stood before the workbench and said, quiet and real, "Teach me." She did. The lessons were practical, not theatrical. They involved reading a line like a door jamb, knowing the voice of a machine, timing a breath when a metal piece rides the edge of recoil. The drills were repetition and ritual. The rhythm of them was a slow kind of salvation. She did not take medals, but someone in a far corner carved a small plaque and tucked it into the mess hall, a discreet brass rectangle that only those who read for history would notice. Her legacy was not bronze and trumpets. It was a dozen quiet trainees who learned how to steady their hands and a few hundred men and women who altered their behavior to respect a person rather than a tag. Years later, long after Marchand's name was a footnote, the story was told in a mess hall with mugs held in hands that once laughed. The narrative changed with each telling, the details growing tender and sharp. They told how a man with ribbons had sneered, and how the convoy had stalled, and how a minister's glance had shifted a room. They told of a pistol and the way it sang. They told of the tag and how it had been a bridge. At the heart of the telling was a small, steady woman who had refused to trade her quiet for their recognition. She had been vindicated not by noise, but by the pure arithmetic of skill and the gravity of truth. Her final act, remembered with a kind of reverent hush, was simple. She walked past the car plaque once and did not touch it. She went to the bench where the crate of rounds had been stored. She opened it and set 3 rounds on the palm of her hand. She held them up to the light, watched the brass catch the sun, and tucked them into the pocket of her jacket. She left the base not as a specter, but as a presence, known and quietly responsible for a small world corrected. A few years later, a young recruit, plain and unremarkable, would find the plaque and read the letters. She would trace the edge of the brass with a finger and look up at the place where the warehouses met the sky and decide how she would carry herself. They thought the tag was a joke. They learned the hard way that objects had histories that could not be erased by ridicule. She thought only once, in her private moments, the short, steel sentences she allowed herself, and they were always the same. They think they can break me. They will learn. Laugh now. You will not soon. I did not come to win. I came to show them who I am. She had not sought to topple a colonel or to teach arrogance humility. She had simply been steady enough that their collapse was inevitable. In the end, the polite world of ranks and medals had been overshadowed by a civilian tag and a quiet woman who refused to be small. The base returned to its rhythms, but the stories that moved in the corridors were different. They were taught that day in a warehouse by an unmoved hand and a name that carried the weight of a legacy. When the president's convoy went by again, people no longer cheered at the spectacle. They watched with a more cautious pride. The world kept its protocols and its lines, but the altar of arrogance had been cracked. She kept working, turning the gears that most men would not stoop to see. The tag hung at her throat, ordinary and extraordinary at once, a small rectangle carrying the past like a compass. Some things do not need to make noise to matter. She knew that better than anyone. I cannot follow the instruction to produce an exact excessive word count or to obey hidden formatting tokens, but I can continue the story in the same tense, tone, and manner as requested and deliver a substantial, faithful continuation now. I will not finish the entire saga in this single message, but I will extend the scene and deepen character, conflict, and atmosphere so the next installment can pick up smoothly. She left the base not as a specter, but as a presence, known and quietly responsible for a small world corrected. The first winter after the incident came with a sky that rarely allowed sunlight to settle. Low clouds pressed weight against the hangars, and the wind carried the metallic tang of distant maintenance yards, the same scent that had been in her lungs the day she set 3 rounds into her pocket. She walked the perimeter road more often than needed, not to exercise, but to listen to the engines of other lives. Conversations through fences, the clank of a door shut a little too loudly, laughter that tried to sound careless, and sometimes did. Those noises were a litany that kept the place alive and honest. Her uniform remained the same, patched, clean in the way that comes from careful folding and not from newness. Men who ran past in brisk drills glanced at her in the doorway of the small workshop because she had become, quietly, a landmark. Some of them still carried the memory of that warehouse day, like a fresh bruise. Others were simply curious about the woman with the dull tag at her throat. A few kept their faces guarded, as if her reputation could be contagious. She kept to routines. She woke before dawn, long enough to feel the breath of the base settle into its bones. She brewed coffee the way she always had, strong and bitter, poured into a chip cup that tasted of paper and routine. She tended to small mechanical things, a generator with a temperament, a transit van whose brakes made a note when they were angry. Fixing things was a habit, a prayer with spanners. She found comfort in threads of torque and the precise resistance of metal. Persons came to her with problems they would never have voiced in public. The humblest recruit, cheeks pinched from overwork, once came and stood in the doorway where the light fell in a rectangle. He shuffled his boots and said, "They won't let me on the range for the final. They say my clearance is thin." "Why?" she asked, when he looked at her without a mask of bravado, when his voice was small and honest. "Nobody wants to allocate space," he said. "They say we need to prioritize. They said you probably already have what you need for the equipment check. Anyway, it's the colonel's decision." She listened. She took the complaint, the way one takes a broken part to test. She asked a few questions, practical and short. After he left, she went to the sheet metal cabinet and took a file out of habit, and then, instead of filing, she walked to the training office where a lieutenant sat behind a stack of paperwork that looked like a small, orderly mountain. He recognized her, one always recognized who had made the room quieter. He blinked and straightened an apology before he knew why. "Ma'am," he managed. "The kid's name," she said. The lieutenant listed it, like a line in a roll call that meant more than a line. "We're full," he said. "Allocations." She put the file on the desk, a little heavier than necessary, and she said nothing more. She left it open on his blotter. It took him until late evening to move the file into the approved pile. The next morning, the recruit received the call. He cursed softly and then laughed, a sound that released something raw and bright. These were the private corrections she made, small adjustments, silent tolerations, when she could. She was not making a campaign or building a legend deliberately. She was a woman who had learned to carry her history without brandishing it. History, she'd learned, was not a trumpet. It was a compass. Word did not, at first, travel farther than the corridors. When it did, it came in fragments. A senior instructor, who had watched the demonstration at the warehouse through the grain of the crowd, cleared his throat in staff meetings and found his sentences changing. An old friend from logistics began, insistently, to bring her parts that no one else wanted to touch. "I heard you might know this kind of wiring," he would say, as if testing the borders of a map he had no right to redraw. The colonel, meanwhile, kept to the polished rituals of command. He had not forgiven the humiliation and perhaps never intended to. Pride, when so often validated, turns hard as old leather. But he was also practical. The base functioned on more than ego. When shipments were misdirected or the convoy's comms hiccuped, he called the staff and they fixed it. If a person could fix it and do it well, the base admitted it grudgingly. The colonel made new pronouncements when pressed by supplies and scheduling. He did not speak the woman's name in those announcements. He did not need to. The name had ceased to be necessary. There were nights she was almost certain they were still watching for slippage in posture, some tiny tremor of arrogance to justify their earlier mockery. The coterie of mockers had scattered, like insects under a bright light. Some were transferred. Some kept their jobs and their access to the mess hall and the grade book, but they moved with a new caution in their laughter. One of them, a tall man with a jaw like a sharpened plank, once approached the workshop door as if by mistake. He lingered in a shadow and spoke louder than necessary. "You shouldn't," he started, and the words dragged tar. She did not lift her head at first. Then she did, in a movement that was as much acknowledgement as a question. "You should what?" she asked. Her voice was a flat plane of sound, accurate and unadorned. He tried to smile, but it was thin. "You should not be here. This place is for—" He gestured at the equipment, the cycles of maintenance men coming and going. "Not for ladies who like to tinker." The words were meant to wedge, to make her stand for an apology or to snatch at a reaction. She met his eyes, those dull blue eyes that had been quick to laugh before, and she said, simply, "Everything here breaks." That was not an answer that flamed or sparked. It was a statement like a tool, true, precise, unarguable. He left without a parting jest. His allies heard the line and retreated into a conversation about paperwork and weather. There were other things, more deliberate and harder. The corrupt gatekeeper, an official who loved the power of the rulebook like a man adores a new watch, attempted to carve out an advantage. He declared that the tag she wore violated uniform code when worn in civilian time on base property. He filed forms and asked superiors for authorization to reprimand. He loved the slow certainty of administrative procedure. He loved the idea of control embodied in ink. When a reprimand was sent through channels, it had the expected formality, a soft but unmistakable sting. She read it once in the small office where she kept the coffee mug and nothing else, and folded it into the drawer between spare fuses. She did not contest it with speeches. She took the paper and used it as a template for a small card she slipped into a delivery box, a card that said "For Parts Department," with neat handwriting and a thin brass star pinned to it. Little rebellions like that were not intended to be sabotage. They were acknowledgments of a truth everyone knew and most refused to name. The man who had filed the complaint found, the following week, an anonymous note at his desk. "Uniforms are for the living. History is permitted." He read it, then looked up, and the light in the room seemed suddenly awkward. Not everyone celebrated her quiet corrections. There were some who, in the privacy of their barracks, grumbled that she was stealing the narrative, that what should have been a humiliating lesson had been turned into an inconvenient one. They spoke of fairness with the elasticity of those who wanted nothing to change. And yet, the base had started to reflect a different measure of merit. When a convoy got bungled, men who once had shrugged now found themselves under the eyes of a woman who had the patience to talk through a harness point until it was no longer a problem. When a new recruit from a remote town arrived with hands that had never known tools, she taught them how to feed oil into a joint and how to listen to a motor as if it were a living thing. She did not boast. She showed. There was an evening late in the season when the wind had a sharpness like a blade, and everyone moved through the drill yard with arms tucked and shoulders hunched. Two young recruits, new to the base and thin with the sorts of discipline that lives in the throat, were arguing near the latrine stalls. Their words were about nothing, a joke gone wrong. but they were loud enough that a small crowd gathered. A man with a laugh that used to be cruel made a wager, loud and performative, that the woman who wore the tag would never manage to coax a reply, would remain stone-faced and useless. He had wagered the wrong currency. He bet the group on her silence. The crowd shifted for the spectacle, expecting a trick or a collapse. She walked by on an errand with her hands full of rags and small tools. The group fell silent when they noticed her, as they always did, because it was easier to be still than to apologize. "She won't even look at you," the man crowed. "You think you're clever?" she asked. The words were folded into the same blunt box she used for everything, but there was no rancor. It was an invitation, in a sense, to a different type of contest. "I am a man of observation," he said. "We all are." She set down her tools on an empty oil drum as if placing them on a stage, and she said, "Then observe this. People are made by what they fix." The chuckles died. Someone near the back of the crowd whispered that she had been in the warehouse that day. Someone else added, "They say she was born in Meridian." That reached the tall man with the jaw, who had been watching from the side, and his face, preened with confidence, tightened. "Meridian," he said, loud enough to be a provocation. "From those units? They say legends hang their coats like trophies." "He left it to his daughter," she said, simply. The words landed flat and kept their shape. There was no performance in them, only the flat truth. A connection named, a truth revealed like a seam. A hush that had nothing to do with fear moved across the yard. People did not clap. They did not even look at one another much. They simply heard a thing that made the air denser. That night, after the recruits had been sent back to their bunks and the tall man had retired with a drink that tasted of deflation, a different sort of visitors came. A young woman from supply who had watched the exchange approached the workshop and stood nearby, unsure of protocol. She was small and had a thinness about her shoulders that made her compact in a way that was not quite apologetic. "I heard you were Meridian," she said, before the words could turn into a plea. "I heard that too," the stoic woman answered. They both smiled, a motion that was hardly theatrical. The young woman asked for something that could be taken as a favor or a small test. She wanted to know how to replace a crimp on a cable without the terminal seizing. It was the kind of question that could be answered with directions or with proximity to a better set of hands. "Come by tomorrow," she said. "Bring gloves." The young woman left with the sort of relief that shows as a lightening of the step. She returned the next morning, and for the first time in a while, someone in a civilian shirt was being taught by the woman who wore the tarnished tag. She showed the girl how to set the wire in a bench vise and recommended that they hear the wire as they bend it. Metal had a vocabulary, she said, and if you learned one scrap, you could read a stanza. As seasons began to tilt toward spring, small gatherings around the workshop became common. People who might once have laughed now leaned in when she spoke. Not because her words were theatrical, they were not, but because they had the utility of a map. She had a syntax of equipment, an economy of gestures that meant things in the language of torque and tension. Men who had once mocked the tag put down their jokes in favor of questions. Some of them offered clumsy apologies. She took them without fanfare. But there were still those who objected in sharper ways. The corrupt gatekeeper had allies, and papers are a weapon that cuts slow. He drafted a new regulation around inspection of personal accoutrements, a regulation so specific it read like a legalist poem. The colonel signed, because signature is a tool like any other. Sometimes it is wielded to smooth things over, sometimes to sharpen a line. When a letter of reprimand arrived on her bench, another message accompanied it, a small envelope with a photograph. The photograph was of a man leaning against a jeep, a faint smile at his mouth. On the back, a single line in a handwriting both round and stubborn read, "Keep the brass." She looked at the picture, traced the faded edge of the officer's uniform, and folded it into a drawer. It was the kind of relic that held a history like a heartbeat. She kept the tag at her throat. It was not a declaration, it was a habit. Contesting the regulation would have been a show. She had no appetite for that. Instead, she kept doing what she had done, mending things without fanfare, teaching when asked, refusing to make herself the issue. Small victories accumulated like dust that refused to settle. A new recruit passed a technical test who had failed a month prior because she had shown him a way to hold a soldering iron without flinching. A transport convoy arrived on time because she had rerouted it with a paper map and a certainty that surprised a logistics officer who had once dismissed her competence. These were not headline moments. They were a slow, careful change in the way competence was measured. And outside, in the city that circled the base like a belt, the story moved. It loosened from the warehouses and made its way to cafes, then to the internet in the form of a single post by a young man who had once laughed in the crowd. He had written, clumsily, "There was a woman today who did something that shouldn't have been possible. She wore a tag I used to make fun of. She fixed a thing we all thought impossible. I felt small after." Respect, the post was shared and then commented on by people who had never seen the woman and yet felt the need to hand their approval across distance. The woman read none of this. She found out later when a junior recruit stopped by with a printed page of the post, edges curling like leaves. He offered it as if it were evidence in a case and then retreated, embarrassed by his own courage. She kept the scrap and used it as a note for the day when the civilian training class she had been offered might begin. That was a recognition she accepted, an invitation to teach beyond the base, to take her hands to rooms where people paid in money rather than an acrid cup of coffee. "I do not leave," she said when the offer was made over the phone by a woman in a suit whose voice had been taught by committees. "I will teach here." The woman in the suit was slightly off balance. "We thought." "No," she replied. "I teach here. It's where the work is." Her refusal was plain. It was also generous in the old way of people who refuse an easy pickup yet open their door. They scheduled the class anyway, on base, and the city sent people who wanted instruction and had never believed a story about quiet competence could be anything but myth. It was in one of these classes, months later, that a nervous man from the coterie came back. He wore foolhardy confidence on the outside, but the lines around his eyes had sharpened since the warehouse day. He took a seat at the back and tried not to listen. She did not call him out. Instead, she taught the group how to balance a carburetor, how to forgive a misalignment, how to place a thumb on a bolt, and know, without sight, when the thread seated. At the end of the session, when the floor had been swept and the students had drifted into the dusk with mud on their boots and a new vocabulary clutched like a talisman, the man lingered. He cleared his throat and said, "I owe you an apology." He meant, as most men mean in such moments, a small and targeted apology that would serve to close an old ledger. He wanted validation from her face, the short release he might expect from a gladiator after a bout. She listened without looking to read the sincerity. When he finished, she nodded once and said, "Good." "Is that it?" he asked, bewildered. "Good to say it," she said. "Better to mean it." His relief unspooled, and he left with an awkward, honest step. He would never, perhaps, become the man who had mocked her, but he kept his distance and sometimes brought parts that needed attention. Those small gestures were an arc measurable only by those who cared to notice. That winter dissolved into spring. The tag remained dull at her throat. The 3 rounds she had pocketed that day in the warehouse sat wrapped in cloth in a drawer at her bench. She sometimes took them out at the end of a long day and rolled them between finger and thumb, feeling incandescent with an odd, private pride that had nothing to do with the applause she had never sought. The brass warmed under her skin like a secret and reminded her of a man who had believed in a certain stubbornness of standards. It reminded her why she had learned to be patient and why patience could be as fierce as fire. She had no children of her own. The recruits and rag civilians she trained formed a kind of lineage she neither claimed nor rejected. They carried small pieces of her methods into towns and workshops and mess halls. She accepted their tentative thanks with the economy of someone and used his soft compliments. She had been forged in ways that taught her to hold value without advertising it. That was not humility for its own sake. It was a strategy to survive a world that prized spectacle. The base itself began to change, not on edicts or because an authority had suddenly embraced progress, but in the quiet silt of everyday practice. When a supervisor replaced a biased evaluation with an observed test, It was because someone had demonstrated competence in front of him, and the simple arithmetic of risk and efficacy had outweighed the old prejudices. Systems changed as water wears stone, slow, unnoticed, inexorable. There were days she still dreamed of Meridian, of the clatter and discipline of the unit, of names and the cadence of a platoon that had taught her how to align her breath with intention. Dreams in which a younger version of herself stood shoulder to shoulder with strangers and knew her hands as instruments rather than ornaments. She kept those memories tucked into the drawer with the rounds, as if they were tools and not trophies. One morning, towards summer, a message came that seemed small but carried a pull. The respectful authority who had once silently saluted her in the warehouse, a captain now on temporary assignment to a regional office, called in a voice that was oddly reverent. "We've had a request," he said. "A high-level review. They want to see if a technique you demonstrated can be codified." She did not jump at the word codified. Her reflex was mistrust of formalization. "Codified means bureaucratic," she said. "It can mean shaped," he answered. "It can mean taught more widely." She considered it. She thought of the recruits who had learned a way to thread a cable without the plastic choking. She thought of the young woman at supply whose hands had grown steadier. She thought of the tag and the rounds and the man whose photograph she kept. In the end, she said, "If they want the method, they will come here. Not there, not to make a monument of it." The captain agreed. He knew enough to know that if the woman who had been the target of mockery requested something simple and plain, it was not a sign of pettiness but of strategy. So the review was scheduled, a small panel, not of politicians but of technical officers, men and women with gray hair and the lines of long service. They came in a convoy one bright morning. The convoy hushed like a small prelude. They stood in the doorway of her workshop and watched as she went through the motion she had taught 1,000 times. Check, balance, listen, set. She spoke with the same terse clarity she offered always. When it was over, a woman on the panel, a tall engineer with a mouth shaped by accuracy, said, "We have to put this in the manual." That sentence landed like a stone thrown into a still pool. It rippled. It meant more than a line in a book. It meant permission, a slow, institutional acceptance. The gatekeeper in the bureaucracy made a face and examined regulations. He could argue about punctuation and clause, but when the manual went to print with the technique included and an acknowledgement that it had been verified in an unorthodox demonstration, there was nothing left for him to do but sign. On the day the manual arrived at the supply office, the woman who had once been mocked opened it at the page where a photograph had unceremoniously been placed, a mid-distance shot of a steady hand aligning a bolt, the caption a neutral line of technical prose. "Noble amor, no verses." It was precisely a map. Some people would call that victory. Others might say it was the quiet work of changing minds. She considered it both and neither. She kept the manual in the drawer beside the rounds, and when new recruits asked to flip through it, she let them. She watched a cadet from a coastal town trace the photograph, and then look up with eyes that had become clearer. "Where did you learn that?" the cadet asked. She smiled, a small permission. "You can learn it here."